Hi, welcome to part 2 of my deep dive into Parallax. We're going to actually build a parallax effect into a website, talk about the math and basic concepts that go into that, as well as some special considerations. So let's dive in. Before we get started, I want to show you the end result of what we're going to be making. So this is our parallax effect. You can see as I scroll, we have this nice layering of animations where each layer moves at a different rate, and our badge here zooms out pretty quickly. So you can see it's nice visual animation. So this is the finished product. What we're going to start out with is this. So here you can see as I scroll through, everything's just flat. This is just our artwork laid out exactly as we want it initially. So let's go ahead and start coding up this parallax effect. So if we look at the markup that makes up this site as it is right now, it's pretty basic. We just have our header element containing a bunch of our image tags. Each of these go from background to foreground in sequence, and they're all positioned with this layer class. So this, if we go up here, you can see this layer class just is absolutely positioning them. So that we're doing all the basic positioning with CSS. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to transform them to update their position using JavaScript. But one thing we can do just to create an interesting effect, if you look at it right now, you can see nothing scrolling, and especially this background. You can see how it has the blue right at the top, but as we scroll, the blue scrolls out of view. Background attachment fixed. And so if we go back to our site, refresh, you'll see that the blue continues to stay with the top of the page as we scroll. So this is just a neat background effect that you can apply to images or any background content that you have within your web page to create some interesting scrolling effects. So let's go ahead and start scripting our parallax effect. The first thing we're going to do is collect all our parallax layers, and we want all the elements that have the class name parallax. Then what we're going to do is go through that array and access each one of those elements. We're going to store these inside of an object array. So I mentioned that we had these data offsets, right? All these offsets up here. And what these are is the parallax effect that we're going for is going to offset the different layers at different rates based on how far we scroll. So this is the number that we're actually going to multiply by the scroll position to offset their amount. What we're going to do is then get the offset value from that element, and then we're going to create a new array, add these values to the array. And so this just makes it easier so that we don't have to keep hitting the DOM and collecting these things over and over, since these values aren't going to change. It's offset value. We just collect it once initially. Then what we're going to do is add an event listener for scroll. And all we're going to do in here is store the scroll position. So we'll collect that initially and then update it down here. So every time we scroll, we're collecting that and updating that variable. And this is really all that's happening in our scroll event, because this can happen a lot and be performance intensive if we're doing a lot of calculations in here. Really all we want to do is update that variable. So we're going to have a separate function that's going to be our animation loop. So we're going to do request animation frame, and request animation frame, what that does is it actually uses the browser's refresh rate to request a new animation frame so that it'll update the animation in sync with the browser. And then we're just going to continuously call that. So that way we'll have an animation loop. So this will just continue to fire as the browser renders. And inside of here, what we're actually going to do is all our calculations for the parallax. So this is where we're actually going to loop through this array and apply the offset to the elements themselves. So we'll do a for loop. We'll do our layers. And what we're going to do is calculate the y. So the new y value is going to be the scroll position of the page multiplied by the layer's offset. Then what we do is we actually apply it to that element. So we take the element. We're going to do translate y since we're only animating along the y-axis. And this should do it. This should get us the effect that we're going for. Switch back over to our scene. Let's see if we get it. There we go. So yeah, so you can see we can actually get that parallax animation happening where all the layers are animating at different rates. And what I can go do then, because we're looking at that data offset attribute, is like, let's say I want this logo to animate in a different direction. So if I just convert that to a positive number and then switch back, you can see now it's going down, scrolling down with me instead of going up when I animate. So the nice thing about doing it this way is it gives us an easy way to adjust these values and play around with them to get the exact scrolling effect that we want. So you can really play with and tweak these values to get the nice visual parallax effect that you desire. So let's talk about some other things to consider. One thing to think about is because this is happening in the animation loop where we're actually updating the transform, is that this is getting updated whether or not this value has changed. So one thing we can do is actually go in here and collect the y value and then check to see if that's changed versus the new value. Then we go ahead and update the transform. Go back into here. You'll see we get visually it's exactly the same, but what we're doing now is checking to make sure that this value is changed before we actually touch the DOM. So another thing to consider is that in some mobile devices, the scroll event does not actually trigger while you're scrolling through the page. It only triggers once you've finished scrolling. So you might not get this smooth animation constantly happening. So one thing we can do then is take this scroll position of the page and move it into our animation loop. Now, again, this is going to happen whether or not this value has changed, so you want to make sure that you're not doing this everywhere. Maybe you do a check here to make sure that you're on a mobile device, and then you no longer really need your event listener, or only apply the event listener if you're not on a mobile device. But that's a way to overcome this issue where it doesn't have the scroll position updated based on the event that's being fired on mobile devices. One other thing to think about is how the scroll wheel actually affects the animation of our parallax effect. So if we go over here, you can see when I scroll with the trackpad, I get a really smooth animation as we scroll through the site. But if I use my scroll wheel, I get this jumping to position. So it's incrementing by much larger amounts and snapping to position. What if I want this smoother animation even while using my scroll wheel? Well, the way we can do that is by tweening or animating these things into position from their current position. We can do that by doing the math and calculating the linear interpolation so that they go from one position to another smoothly, or we can use a tweening library. I'm going to use my favorite tweening library, which is GreenSock's Tween Max. And here's the CDN for the Tween Max library. What we can then do is get rid of our request animation frames, since Tween Max under the hood already manages request animation frames, so it's going to throttle these automatically. And then we can fire our animate method inside our scroll event. And then what we're going to do is get rid of this where we're actually applying the transform, and instead call Tween Max to then reference our layer, set a duration for the tween, and then we're going to actually set the values. So set y to the y value, and then set override to all. And what this is telling it to do is each time it hits this, it's going to overwrite the tweens instead of continuing to add new tweens so they don't get longer as we get new ones added to it. And so you can see even with the scroll wheel, I'm getting this smooth animation into position. So that's one way that we can apply this cool easing effect to our scroll parallax animation.